So, welcome to another episode of the Colorado Protectors Podcast. This is the podcast for the Colorado Fraternal Order of Police. My name's Frank Gale. I'll be hosting today's episode, which is about emotional trauma and mental health and wellness for law enforcement officers and first responders. Joining us today is Rebecca Allanson. We may be joined later by another clinician, Susie Zavala. But we're going to get started now first with Rebecca. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. What I want you to do is tell us a little bit about your background and how you became involved with counseling and wellness services.
Yeah, thank you for having me first and foremost this morning. I think this podcast is invaluable for our members. So I am a retired police officer. So I joined law enforcement in Sydney, Australia in 1996, immigrated to the United States in 2002, and joined the Arvada Police Department here, where I served about 10 years. And then I did the last 3 years as a cold case homicide detective with Jefferson County District Attorney's Office. And for me, my journey in law enforcement, I was predominantly a detective for probably a good 15 of the 18 years that I was in law enforcement, and also predominantly worked persons crimes. So homicide, suicide, death investigations, robbery, persons crimes, the kind of heavier stuff. And have been very public. I had a breakdown in 2014. I began experiencing some trauma symptoms in 2013 that surfaced in intrusions, night terrors. I began drinking more and more alcohol to try and cope, which is a really common coping mechanism. And that became problematic. It resulted in psychological and physiological dependence. I became addicted to alcohol in my trauma. And so I resigned my position in law enforcement, but I was going to get fired. It was around the corner. So I call it a preemptive strike, but left and then spent a few months getting myself back together, and then began a nonprofit organization called Badge to Badge. And that was to really provide support services, resources, and a place for first responders to go to talk about the challenges of the job. And in doing that work, in those early days for Badge to Badge, where we had a support meeting and I would show up every week, and sometimes people would show up, sometimes people wouldn't show up, but I would, keep the coffee pot on, so to speak, and then began to see that there was a need for clinical services where the person providing the clinical services had actually done the job of the first responder. Didn't realize how significant that would be. Started addictions counseling classes, then continued with my master's in clinical counseling, and now I'm doing my doctorate in psychology. So got licensed and then began working with the FOP quite a number of years ago, I think probably 2016 or 2017, providing services for the FOP, and now provide exclusive clinical counseling and neurotherapy services just for first responders here in the Denver metro area. Well, not just in Denver, really. Across our entire state, we're enabled to reach, corners of Colorado we couldn't before with telehealth services. So really, it's statewide services we provide.
And so, you bring up the work that you're doing with the Colorado FOP, and we've talked about it on our podcast before. We always give a plug in for the Colorado Police Officers Foundation, which is the Colorado FOP's foundation, and that is the organization that funds the work that you're doing through Badge to Badge and Badge Responder Services to help officers with emotional trauma and mental health wellness. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's we did want to talk about that organization. Anybody who's interested in learning more about the Colorado Police Officers Foundation and the services that they provide, and the programs that are offered, should go to the website, coloradopolicefoundation.org. Lots of great information there, and even contact information for the services that are being provided by Rebecca are on there as well. So, one of the things I want to do at this point, I know that, we worked together and produced a video to kind of outline some of the people who have utilized services through your organization. And I think we want to play that now. It's about a 7-minute video, but I think it's very compelling. And I think anybody who is watching this that is either an officer or a police officer or a first responder of any type, or a family member, or even just the general public will find it, I think, very impactful.
I was working a cold case homicide at the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office, and it was a homicide investigation involving a young woman who'd been killed in the early 2000s. On the heels of that 3-year case was the Jessica Ridgway homicide, the little girl who was 10 years of age at the time who was killed. And I remember a pivotal point in time. I was sitting in a room with the pathologist who had done the autopsies on my case and on Jessica's case, and many other cases, Columbine, all of the serious shootings we've had here, Platte Canyon, etc. And the pathologist, a very experienced man, started crying in the middle of this meeting. And he said, "I can no longer understand the horrors that human beings can do to other human beings." And there was something profound about that statement that I soaked in, and I went home and I broke down. And I thought, here's this man who has all of this experience and all of this time that he has had this really important job, and he's broken. And it gave me permission to be broken too. But at the same time, the moment that happened, it was like the lid on all of my trauma came up and out.
I started with the Sheriff Department in 1990. Thought it was the job of a lifetime. I enjoyed it. I recently retired in 2020. And when I retired, I was pretty much at the end of my rope.
When your family comes to you and says, we're not your suspect, you're treating us like a suspect, you kind of start to put things into perspective.
I sometimes now say to deputies, don't think that when you go in that job that your family don't experience exactly what you're experiencing. Because when you go home, you are a changed man from when you left the house versus when you return after each and every shift.
I was a darn good cop, but when it came to on the emotional level, I buried a lot.
I found myself considering taking my life because I thought, I'm not contributing. I have no purpose anymore. And I think they're normal thoughts that we have when we've given ourselves so much to the profession, right? We get in this job because we want to help.
I was involved in a shooting a couple years before I finally retired, and I guess that kind of just put me over the edge. But I was still functioning on the job for several years, even though I was pretty much falling apart.
Everybody in this capacity has a bucket. When that bucket gets full, it starts to overflow. Either you're in a dispatcher, you're in EMS, you're in fire, you're in police, what have you. The too much, too soon, too often scenario comes into play.
I called a friend of mine who was in law enforcement. I said, I need you to come and get my gun and ammunition, and I need you to ask me no questions about it, and I need you not to give it back to me. And he drove down and he took it. And then I began doing research and learning about trauma and substance abuse and addiction, and understanding that there was so much neurobiological impact. And the path led me to opening up a nonprofit organization in 2015 that I had no idea what that was going to do. I just thought, there's got to be other people who need help. Like, maybe I can help another cop.
I am fresh out of treatment. I am fresh out of opening myself up and asking for that help. And it was one call to Fraternal Order of Police who connected me with Rebecca and Kelly. and they partner with FHE in Florida, which is Florida House Experience. The one unit that they have that is rare and unique is Shatterproof. And Shatterproof is for all first responders.
The reason why this is important for all first responders is that you have an outlet with your peers that understand what you're talking about, opposed to just, the general population. You go in and you talk about a bad call you may have been on, and to the general population, the only thing they can probably relate it to is maybe an episode of 911 they watched last week. Whereas the other people in the room are like, yeah, I've been on similar calls to that.
Group work for the first responder population is very powerful. To be in a group with like-minded people, it's very comforting, it's validating, and it supports people to have more confidence that they can share openly and also learn from other people.
When I was at my worst before contacting Rebecca, I couldn't have taken care of anyone. Couldn't take care of myself. After the treatment, after finding the self-worth, and after realizing and understanding that so many people depend on you, loves you, need you, it forces you to step up.
I told him what was going on. Like, I'm only getting like 4 or 5 hours of sleep. I don't like going out in public. Like, my hypervigilance is just crazy. And they're like, well, you don't have to live like that. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's why I'm here. So they said, let's get your sleep under control first and then move on from the rest of that. It was life altering.
After neuro, I've experienced some of these triggers that would normally set me off, and I've been fine. I've continued through investigating death investigations, suicides, and after having this, I'm able to work through them and be more approachable and comforting to victims and other officers.
I think there's an expectation by the community that we should be better as law enforcement. We should be able to be empathic and be emotional towards the community. And I see the gap that exists. And the gap is that you can't be empathetic and emotionally connected when you're traumatized. You can't heal other people when you're unhealed yourself.
What the FOP and what Badge to Badge has done for me is given me my life back.
You can't do it on your own, and you need a group of peers to help you through this, people that have been down this road before, that's going to help you navigate this, because it's incredibly hard to do by yourself, if not impossible.
What we really hope for law enforcement is that people begin utilizing services more and more, clinical services in advance of any issues, so that they can prevent the big trauma impact, the big kind of compartment opening and spilling up everywhere. But it's imperative that they have access to them.
As I said before, you can tell that the video was very impactful, and it shows and demonstrates people that are working in the program that we provide through the Colorado FOP and the Colorado Police Officers Foundation here that Rebecca oversees. And you can see the good work that's being done and how it's helped people. We are joined now by Susie Zavala, who's one of the clinicians who works on our program as well. And I wanted to welcome Susie. And Susie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became involved in counseling services and wellness services for law enforcement and first responders?
Yes, thank you for having me on. I come from a history of my dad being in the military, and then when he retired, he became a police officer. So I grew up in this arena my whole life, and promptly after college, I joined the fire service. So I've been a firefighter for 20 years. My husband's a firefighter. And from there, I think I really recognized that there was a mental health issue within first responders, and I really wanted to put it upon myself on how I can do this and how I can transition my career into helping others and helping first responders coming from a culturally competent perspective. I knew that that was one of the things that stood out to me the most, was that this competency piece was missing within the mental health arena, and I really wanted to fill that puzzle piece in. So that's kind of what brought me here and brought me into the arena of helping first responders.
Well, yeah, I mean, that seems to be kind of a common theme, really. You know, people were either in the business or, you know, as first responders and law enforcement, or they had family members, lots of military as well. And I think we see a lot of people in the profession and also that are involved in the program that, you know, have that experience in common. You know, I wanted to talk about something after we saw the video, and you know, people are talking about the crises that they went through, and you know how they were able to you know get help for those crises. But I think, you know, the elephant in the room is the mounting suicides that happen in the first responder community and happen with law enforcement. I saw a news report that was from earlier this year, done on ABC News, that talked about that, officer suicides. And in that report, it covered a 7-year period between 2016 and 2022. There was over 1,200 public safety officers who died by suicide. I mean, that's pretty significant. And I think, you know, just given what we know about the situation, that's probably even low. I think there's a lot of them that never get reported. You know, the FBI did a report that showed that there was far fewer than that, and it's really, I think, because it's difficult to track them. But this particular study was done by an organization that's called First Help and CNA Corporation, and First Help is an organization that tracks law enforcement and first responder suicides. And they partnered with the data scientists from CNA Corporation, a nonpartisan research organization. And CNA Center for Justice Research and Innovation provided technical assistance in doing the research with criminal justice agencies across the country. And that's where they came up with the number, you know, that was over 1,200 during that time period, which I think the actual number was 1,287. That's an average of over 180 a year, just according to this study. And like I said, I think that's low. One of the things that was identified in the report on ABC News was that the people that were tracked in this study who had taken their own lives were suffering with mental health challenges and emotional trauma. And the report found that the most prevalent situations were either depression, that was 34% of the people that were captured in this study, and PTSD, which was 27%. I think what we're talking about here and what we've been trying to do with the program that you guys work in is get officers to understand that they have to, they gotta ask for help. They gotta reach out. They have to do something to help themselves and improve their own emotional health. And they you know, as hard as it might be, as difficult as it might seem to them, you know, if they just make a call, you know, there's resources and they can get the help that they need. Because this thing identified, you know, PTSD, and I think we know that lots of first responders suffer from depression, PTSD. How would you describe emotional trauma? How would you describe PTSD or PTSI? Rebecca?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, they're two separate, but there's some overlap between emotional trauma and post-traumatic stress injury. And so we in the last probably 5 to 8 years in the first responder world, we've labeled, titled post-traumatic stress. There's a disorder that's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that we use, Susie and I, for the purpose of diagnosis. If that's what we're doing with the client, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's so much labeling that goes with diagnosis. And our profession of people, we don't really like labels that much. They box us in. it's not really helpful for some people to have post-traumatic stress disorder. They're like, oh, I knew that. Now what? So we've kind of titled this to post-traumatic stress injury. Why? Because an injury is something that you can recover from. We now understand that mental health, that when people experience first responders or general public, when anyone experiences mental health symptoms of depression, anxiety, intrusions of thought, mood imbalances, brain fog, memory issues, remembering around the events of emotional trauma, we often kind of think, well, that we're stuck with this. Our brain is stuck with this way of thinking. We now know the brain is neuroregenerative, right? Neuroplastic. So we can actually reform neural pathways, form new neural pathways, heal mental health. And there are other modalities that we now know that we do use here at the FOP, I think more really than anyone else across the Denver metro area, any other psych services agency, which is really concentrating on modalities of treatment that go beyond just talk therapy, right? Ketamine, neurotherapies, stellate ganglion block. I mean, there's a variety of different things that we can use now to treat. But when we're talking about emotional trauma, by definition, for me, that is just our psychological and cognitive processing or attempts to understand the traumatic incident. And so when we're emotionally traumatized, it's not complete. We've not yet wrapped our brain or our arms metaphorically around what we saw that was traumatic, what we heard, what we smelt, the experience of the trauma. So for trauma, when we experience trauma that rises to the level of post-traumatic stress injury, for me, that's really trauma that is stuck in short-term memory, that is stuck in some aspect of us attempting to grasp and understand what happened in the call that we were on, in the crisis situation. And so that in of itself, that attempt to grasp, and then when something is different than our morals and values, when we as human beings believe that it's not okay to put a baby in a microwave, and you go to a call where a heroin addict put the baby in the microwave because it wouldn't stop crying, your values are met with something that is very different. And when we have too much of that, our compartment gets too full, our brain can't process. As human beings, our heart can't reconcile. Energetically, we can't, and trauma surfaces.
Yeah, I just want to add on to a couple things with that. When it comes to post-traumatic injury, I like to look at it as an injury to the nervous system, because that encapsulates for first responders that like, oh, if it's an injury to my nervous system, how do I fix it? Or if I tell you have a disease or a disorder, it's like, what pill do I need to take? Because I have no way of fixing this. Yeah. So I really like to box those two and say, if it's an injury, we can fix this. It's like you go to somebody like a clinician that can help break this down for you. So I really like the term injury, as Rebecca pointed out. Also, Rebecca pointed out emotional trauma and kind of the differences. I think the other thing that happens with first responders is it's not just about the call. Sometimes we have these adverse childhood experiences, and if I had to guess, more first responders would have a higher adverse childhood experiences coming into the field because their purpose is to help others because of how their childhood was. So now they're coming into the field already with full trauma buckets and with a nervous system that's already dysregulated, and on top of the calls that Rebecca is talking about. So now they have this resiliency factor that they had growing up, and then all of a sudden, like, they're unable to manage that. And how do they combine the two? So it's really nuanced when we talk about emotional trauma and what it can all pertain to.
Yeah, and just to add to something you're saying, Susie, which is so valuable. So Dr. John Violante is a retired police officer, and he's kind of the foremost expert in doing research into trauma and police officers. And he did a study using the ACEs study, which is what Susie's talking about here, which was a study done in the 90s where Kaiser Permanente
And the CDC.
and the CDC began looking at disease, like people getting diseases, and including addiction, which is a disease, a medical disease, and began looking at incidents that occurred in childhood that could be contributing. So John Violante's work extends upon that and talks about what Susie's saying here, which is that when first responders come on board with high ACEs scores, so the score is out of 10, what I would consider to be a high ACEs score, and I think generally in the community is above like a 5 or a 6, of incidents that occur when they're younger. And they can be things like emotional trauma, it can be somebody being arrested in the home, it can be a parent that passes away or a parent that's absent. It doesn't have to be sexual trauma, although that is included, of course. It can be emotional trauma, neglect, bullying,
Divorce.
things of that nature. Absolutely. And so his work looked at people coming on the job were at a substantial amount, a significant amount more susceptible for post-traumatic stress injury than regular public. So we know that these together are important. There's also a study that came out recently, I can get this for you, that talks about how on average a police officer during the course of a career in law enforcement is exposed to in excess of 800 critical incidents during the course of their career versus 2 or less than 2 incidents that the general public is exposed to. And I think that says a lot. 800 plus critical incidents. And then we forget that our first responders and our police officers are human beings with human brains and human functioning, and are just as susceptible to falling to constant and chronic exposure in the nervous system, in being able to grasp it from a cognitive standpoint, psychologically, physiologically, right? So it's just some things to kind of add in there that I think are valuable for the conversation.
So if you're, a first responder, you're a law enforcement officer, or you're a coworker or a family member, what would be some of the indications that a person should be seeking help and should be, trying to get counseling?
Yeah, I think you could look at it in a couple of different things. So you look at the emotional and psychological. Like, is there fear, guilt, shame, humiliation, like all these emotions that come out? I think that's all those low-level emotions are very irritable for those people that are going through traumatic stress. So you'll see a lot of those emotions. And then you can look at the behavioral, like what's going on behaviorally with them. Are they impulsive? Are they irrational? Are they just their baseline is not normal? And then the other thing you can look for, if it, not the emotional, not the behavioral, but what's going on biologically, like headaches, like are they have like chronic inflammation, things going on that normally wouldn't be happening inside the body. We know that trauma manifests itself internally, especially when it's gone on for so long. We know that it's oxidative and you could have actual DNA changes from this. So we know that physically we have response to that as well. So you can kind of look at it at the different buckets.
Yeah, and one of the biggest evidentiary indicators to that is this testosterone, estrogen, low end of that. So I've been working with the FOB and doing clinical work for a decade now. And so probably 2 or 3 years in to my psychotherapy work, I began noticing this consistency with first responders or police officers around low libido, belly, gut, kind of like a gut, and fatigue and all of these different things. And myself began looking into it, understanding some of what was going on in the body. We now know far more than we did 20 years ago about trauma and mental health. We now know what Susie and I are talking about here is the physiological component, not just the psychological component. So this manifestation that Susie's talking about, that's very valid for family members, because they're going to be able to see stomach aches, leaky gut syndrome kind of things, right? Which is common.
Oh, sleep. Let's not forget sleep.
Oh, and sleep. Yeah. Absolutely. So you're going to begin, seeing manifestations of those for sure. And I began noticing with these clients, they were going and getting their hormone levels checked, and their testosterone levels were well under 100, which for men really should be 300 plus to be normal. And then concurrently, women with estrogen levels that were low. And began looking at the work of Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, who is revered in the area. His book on emotional survival for law enforcement should be read and is probably read by most police officers and police officer families out there. And he talks in there about a scientific basis. It's called the hypervigilance biological roller coaster, where the impact of cortisol and adrenaline dump on our system, right? So you imagine a patrol officer, you're in your car at the beginning of shift, you're getting going, you're probably at level yellow, if we're still using colors, white being nothing is wrong, there's no threat, black being crisis, urgent duty, right, threat is there, and then every level in between. And so we leave the station and maybe we go to a call where it's an accident, and then somebody gets in our face and we begin getting a little adrenaline dump and cortisol dump. We resolve that, we get back in our car, we go back to the station and do paperwork, where again, our body is constantly seeking homeostasis. So it's trying to pull ourselves down, right, and get to a nice level of cortisol and adrenaline. Then your partner calls, they're in a fight. So you're leaving the station and you're driving urgent duty across the Denver metro area to get to your partner. You're dumping copious amounts of cortisol and adrenaline. And this is the up and down of your day. And then you go home and your body's trying to pull you back to homeostasis and cannot. What does that do for hormone levels? Is it impacts DHEA production, which is a precursor for testosterone and estrogen. So we now know we have this very strong link between two. So we can now work with clients, as Susie and I do with our work with members, where we're working on more than just what's going on psychologically with them or cognitively. We're working to resource them on systemic, physiological, and biological components so that they can understand, link, and then resource themselves to improve in that area.
But it goes back to that sleep that we were talking about. I think in Europe, they just listed shift work as a class 3 carcinogen because they know that there's a link to it. In the US, we're not quite there yet. I think we're still looking to get our evidence to prove that. But also, when you look at how we emotionally regulate ourselves through the night, if we're doing shift work and we're not getting into full REM sleep, we're not integrating our emotions. They call it the therapy of sleeping when you're actually getting into REM sleep. So if you're not allowing your body to sleep effectively and efficiently, you're not able to do that throughout the day. And you're in this irritable mode that's constant and continuous. And then when we see them, that's usually my first question. How are you sleeping? Like, what are we doing? Yeah. So that's often what comes from that sleep indicator, is that they're not emotionally integrating what's happened through the day.
Yeah.
So how does addiction, substance abuse, how does that play into this?
Wow. Well, we have, I think it's so interesting that earlier you were talking about statistics, right? We were talking about suicide statistics, because I see a correlation between that and also addiction or alcohol abuse related statistics, right? It's underreported. It's difficult to grasp accurate data. And I think that's a challenge to get accurate statistics. Currently, I think out there in the world, anywhere between 2.5 and 3 out of every 5 police officers has a substance abuse problem. Now, that doesn't mean they're alcoholic. It doesn't mean that it cannot be reversed or they can't go back. It just means they're abusing substances. Why do we do that in the profession? We do it as a coping mechanism. We do it to try and sleep. We do it because it's normalized. There's validation inside of the law enforcement community to drink, to relax, to drink, to forget, that we deserve it when we get home off shift. We've had a tough day. We should be able to drink to forget, to relax. We have all of these justifications. And it's a slippery slope, because there's no there's no body that jumps out at you and says, hold on a second. If you keep drinking like this for one more month, you are now going to be physiologically and psychologically dependent. We know that there is a point, like a metaphorical line of demarcation, for want of a better term, but there is a point where people go from having choice around what they're drinking. I'm just going to have 2 drinks tonight, and they're able to put it down, not think about it, not white knuckle through it, but be able to be safe around it. Or I'm going to take a month off drinking and have that be fine. And then it's a very quick and slippery slope to somebody not being able to control it anymore. And because we don't understand as a general public, we still do not think that this is a disease. It is accepted in the medical community. It is a brain disease. There is neurological changes that occur slowly and progressively in the disease that prioritize the substance as the most important thing, that have craving and obsessive thought components, that hijack your brain and nervous system and push you into physiological and psychological dependence.
So, and I used to think when I was on the job, and it's interesting since I've been retired 6 years now, that I was thinking about this the other day. I went out with some friends and we were at a bar and I got a beer and I was drinking a beer and I didn't even finish it. It was interesting, and I realized, I was like, man, this is the first beer I had in about a month. And it just dawned on me. I was like, I used to drink a lot more when I was still working in law enforcement. And I don't know, maybe that's just me. But I always thought that people that I worked with, that I would see drinking excessively when we were off, and I would realize, I knew then, even that I was like, yeah, they're having some tough issues. They're dealing with some things here. And I thought they're just trying to self-medicate. They're trying to self-medicate. I want to do this because I want to feel better. And so I'm going to feel better. And this is, obviously I don't think it necessarily has that impact. Although I guess, in moderation it could.
It does. I mean, self-medication, you hear that probably most commonly. People will acknowledge, the cop will acknowledge that, yeah, I'm self-medicating a bit. But then there's this denial around the severity around it, or this comparison that we do. Well, if you're not the homeless dude living under a bridge that doesn't have their job and has lost their fancy, and then drinking from a paper bag, then it must be okay. Yeah. And because there's an acceptability around it in the community, there's a denial about it, and then it's even made worse inside of the first responder profession.
Absolutely. Just as you were saying, Frank, when you go out with your fellow first responders, like that's something that you guys do to connect and communicate with each other. Everybody goes out and gets beers. So it becomes this like acceptable norm to go out and drink. And then 6 years pass and you're retired, you're like looking backwards going, oh, wait a minute, like maybe that wasn't as normal as I thought it was. But we do tend to communicate and connect around alcohol and drinking. And that's when binge drinking comes up a lot, is that I only do it around my first responder friends when we go out to the bars and drink. And then they think it's okay because it's like, I don't do it at home. I go 4 days without drinking, but then I go out and have a 6-pack or whatever it is.
Or way more.
Or more.
Well, how do you deal with I know throughout my career, and I think I see this now, although I think it's lessened, there's a stigma attached with reaching out and saying, hey, I need help. I'm having trouble. I've got emotional problems. I need counseling. And what would you say to people, or how would you address that?
I think this is a great opportunity to bring up organizational wellness and organizational stressors. We know that occupational stress is a big hazard, but organizational stress is far worse than anything that you can do with occupational stress. So when it comes to the health and wellness of your organization, there's a term called psychological safety. And if somebody doesn't feel safe to come forward because of fear of retribution, fear that this is going to be punitive, fear that something bad's going to happen, fitness for duty ends up coming up, like all these terms, I'm not going to be able to do my job again, they're going to take my badge, all this fear comes up around this organizational, how the organization deals with this type of stuff. So I think it's an important topic to talk about, is what is the psychological safety of, do people feel that the organization is trusted, that they're able to come forward and communicate openly with the leaders without it being punitive?
I feel very strongly about this because as an officer who went through something with my organization where I voluntarily disclosed that I was not doing well, I had no disciplinary issues. 2 weeks prior to that, I just received my evaluation, which was better than anyone else's in the entire office. Yet the moment I disclosed to my agency that I was struggling and had mental health issues, I became the criminal. Mm-hmm. What happened to me 10 years ago is still happening. What happened to me is I went to the psych services agency that was contracted with my agency. And during session with my clinician, the chief would come on to the session and listen to the conversation. Now, I've never had anything that intrusive that I've heard of. That's pretty egregious. Would demand to know after each session how I was doing. So there was no privacy for me there was no confidentiality, and there was no safe space for me to share what was going on with myself. And I was critically suicidal at the time. Absolutely, with my gun out on the table, like gonna take my damn life, suicidal at the time. And to feel like I went to my agency and my agency said, like every agency does, you can trust us. Mm-hmm. We won't punish you if you come forward. And to have that happen and to have me not have a space to process anything was I still cannot wrap my brain around it, really. And then the second part of that too is there was a whole other level of, I'd worked this case, and I share it on the video, this Jessica Ridgway case. It was this little 10-year-old little girl. You'd remember it was Westminster Fire.
I was working that night.
And it was a horrible case that absolutely shook the entire first responder community. And it specifically, like in doing that work and in working that case and then in coming forward to my agency and saying, I need help, and then to be shunned and treated in that way and pushed, it's just outrageous, and it still happens. I think that most agencies want to have wellness programs and they want to provide services, but I think that it behooves the police officer in this scenario and our membership to be cautious about who they trust. Because there's no confidentiality between you and your sergeant. There's no confidentiality between you and your chief. There is confidentiality between you and your union member or your Fraternal Order of Police Lodge or your clinician. But it's about trust, and it's about, it's about being able to trust that, which is questionable.
Absolutely. I think it starts with leadership, and I think authentic leadership from the top has to be able to identify their own, I guess, maybe faults and failures, because then that creates authenticity within an organization. And then it creates this trust within an organization. So I think it's incumbent upon leadership to really start at the top and how they can be how can the organization be well and have this just overall trust so that people like Rebecca could come forward without feeling like there's going to be retribution.
Well, I mean, it's great that you guys brought that up. I mean, because certainly I think our vision for why we wanted to create a mental health wellness program through the FOP and use our foundation to pay for the costs of it and the expenses of it. I mean, the people who were involved in that, a friend of mine, Mike Violette, God rest his soul, and myself, and Steve Schultz and some other, Mike Didon, people who were in the FOP leadership, and said that we need this because we were seeing people who were on the job and were expressing to their agencies that they needed help, and then all of a sudden they lose their career and weren't necessarily any better off emotionally. It'd been one thing, they lost their career, but at least the agency helped them. But they weren't really necessarily even better off. So, and that was the reason why we created this situation. And even today, and I'm just going to say for myself, I have concerns around the confidentiality. Agencies are hiring either in-house mental health professionals, or they're contracting with organizations to do this, and we we see that there are concerns around the confidentiality, and that people are accessing these services and then suddenly still finding themselves in a fitness for duty, and not necessarily being helped, and not necessarily having that outreach, and they're in a belief system that, well, what I tell this person is confidential. And obviously we know that legally they can't tell you certain things and expect it to be confidential. If they're, expressing suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, if they are, sounding like they're going to harm themselves or others, that's going to be reported. But if they're just talking about, other things that are happening and the way they're feeling, and then the agency's like, I don't know if we want this person to be on the agency anymore, and they start moving them in a direction that is designed to eliminate them because of risk management. And I understand that because I was in management in my career. I understand the whole risk management thing, but there's a human deal too. There's a human perspective, and people who are good officers and good employees, if they're, they can continue to be that despite whatever, emotional trauma they're suffering, whatever their issues are, if they get the right help. Anyway, that's just my personal take on it. But thank you guys for raising that.
Can I add something in there?
Sure.
Just quickly around suicidal ideation, because there are requirements that where there is law that says if somebody's actively suicidal, actively homicidal, abusing an elderly person or a child, or going to commit a terrorist attack, we would be required to breach the clinical alliance and get intervention outside.
Sure.
However, I want to address suicidal ideation here because I don't want people hearing that and having that be a stop to people getting access to services. So here's what there is to say about that. Most of my clients that come in have had suicidal thoughts at some point in time during the course of their career. Many of them a serious suicidal thought, not acted upon. Mm-hmm. I think we do a really horrible job inside the organization, in institutionalized conversation, and also in our culture of saying that it's okay to talk about it. Now, if somebody comes into our office and is sitting across from us and they have a plan and they're going to leave and harm themselves or somebody else, and they're serious and it's all together, and there's nothing we can do to intervene, yes, we would be required to breach that relationship. I've never had to do it during the course of my 10 years, and I've worked with many suicidal people. Why? Because our obligation when we're doing that session is to help that person, is to set them up with services. And if somebody is that critical, then we're going to be talking about some type of inpatient, some type of psychiatric crisis services for them, and having a conversation around that. So it's not like when somebody comes in and they say, I was suicidal 2 weeks ago, we're not calling 911 and the police are showing up and scheduling you.
Sure.
We understand that as much as the next person, because we've seen people being scheduled. We know for most people it's actually horribly ineffective at providing intervention, but effective at providing a temporary way of people not taking their lives. Yeah. But it's not something that I've ever had to do, and it would always be something that we would talk about with the person first, and would be very carefully done.
Yeah, I think autonomy is the biggest thing in this whole discussion. Like, I want my client to feel that they're making the decision to go get help and that I'm not forcing something upon them. So I, just like Rebecca, every time I've had this conversation with somebody, they're self-admitting, they're going, you know what, I think I do want to go get help. And they're making that decision, and I don't have to force the hand and breach confidentiality in any respect. I will sit there and have the conversation as long as I need to get them to work through whatever's happening and going on in their life.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit about critical incident response, and actions in relation to traumatic events, and how does that work through the program you guys are currently working in?
So if, for example, there's a critical incident officer involved shooting, OIS, or something of that nature, and a member requires something from us, we can do, a debriefing, an individual debriefing with the client. We could offer a debriefing for members of a certain lodge, or even just membership of a certain agency. Group debriefings are phenomenally powerful to help understand and process and normalize the critical incident experience. And then doing ongoing work with the person moving forward, which can include work with the family unit, which is an integral part, because usually during a critical incident in OIS, it's not just the police officer that's impacted. If they've been the person that has shot somebody, the entire family unit is impacted. The spouse, the kids, and particularly if there's any media coverage around it, it can put immense pressure on the family unit. So it's about providing that service and then, providing some wraparound services ongoingly for what's needed.
Absolutely. And I think in addition to that, timeline is critically important. When it comes to the first 48 hours, it's important that those people get a defusing, which is just basic psychoeducation, maybe even like a little pamphlet about what might happen in the next 48 hours. They don't like go over the call or anything. It's just down and dirty really quick. After that, within a week, we'd like to do a debrief where we're sitting down with him and we're actually going over the call. We know from research that it's critically important that you follow a timeline. In 2 months, you're doing a follow-up. In 3 months, you're doing a follow-up. At that 1 year anniversary, we have to be checking in, like making sure that they're still doing okay. And then as Rebecca said, going back to the family, like I always mention family when give this pamphlet to your spouse, what's the age of the kids so we could talk about appropriate conversations. And as the kids age, like those conversations become different. My dad's a police officer. How do I understand his job and what happens? So those are really important conversations and really critical to bring up in those moments, because often when their kids are so young, the officer doesn't think about that. And then they're like, oh, my kids too? I never thought I was going to have this conversation, but yeah, you're right. I'm going to have this conversation eventually. So I like to just kind of prime the pump during those times to these are good times to start thinking about these conversations. And then also when it comes to the spouse, it's important to have a conversation prior to incidences with your spouse about what she wants to know and what she doesn't want to know. Or he. I'm sorry. Here I am just identifying. So spouses in general, partners, how about that one? Partners, having this conversation ahead of time when you first have this job, like what is it that I can talk to you about and what is it that I can't talk to you about? Sure. I think that communication is critical to start with when it comes to officers.
Great.
And I know some, that there are some agencies who do these debriefings around critical incidents, and I think some of them say they do it and then they don't do it. That was what I saw, and that's what I've seen. And I've been involved in law enforcement, for over 30 years, and I've seen varying degrees of commitment to this by various agencies, and so some of them are doing good work with it, and I would say most are not. I'm just going to be honest. That's my opinion. I know that in Rebecca's case, that she specifically has worked through local FOP lodges to do this with situations where there was an officer-involved shooting or an officer killed in the line of duty, and we've hosted things inside our facility. Would you guys recommend that lodges do outreach if they're having a critical incident, if there's an experience of a critical incident, something significant,
Absolutely.
major traumatic event, and reach out to you guys to schedule something like this and put it together?
No, absolutely. And here's what I would say about that. You're right. Agencies try and do something, but many agencies don't really have access to be able to do anything. And then what they end up doing is having somebody on their peer support or a commander doing the debrief, which, kind of eliminates the point of the confidentiality and safe space that needs to be created around it. So yes, I would definitely recommend they reach out to us. Why? We don't work for the agency. So there's never going to be any relationship that we have with their organization that is going to even cause any question or concern about what is talked about during the debriefing or diffusing is going to be shared, because it's not going to be shared. The fact that Susie and I have done this job, Susie is still active, means we understand more than anything the importance of confidentiality. If we don't have confidentiality and a safe space for people to share what they have or what they want to share about a specific incident, then what we're doing is a completely moot point. So that is, extremely important to us and what we pride ourselves on in our programs that we provide.
So, we're taping and filming this particular episode during holiday season, because we know that during holidays, sometimes there's an elevated concern around the issues we've been discussing. And so I think, we're just going to close out, and I wanted to let you guys, close out with any comments or remarks or, ideas that you'd like to leave people with.
Yeah, when it comes to, I guess, the holidays, we definitely see an uptick in crisis and call volume. There just seems to be an emotional, evocative emotional time. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to, I guess, protecting your well-being, definitely create traditions with your family. That is going to bring you back to this home base, empty your trauma bucket. So when you get back home, create a tradition with your family, create something that's unique to you and yours so that you're not carrying all this extra stuff in that moment.
Yeah, all of what Susie said. And, one of the things that I think most people are unaware of that we provide in our programs is peer support. And so we have 17 peer support personnel who volunteer their time to provide our members with a listening, a phone call at 2 a.m., a validation, a peer that they can talk to. And these services are available and specifically available at this time of year. So for folks that maybe are resistant and don't necessarily want to speak to a clinician because they're not ready yet, we could put them with a peer. Now, the peer is probably not going to be working for their organization, so there's that additional separation, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, I have a lot of fire peers, so sometimes putting a police officer with a firefighter is great. It's just that extra, level. But, being able to speak to somebody that you trust, if you trust your agency peer support services, and you trust somebody in that program, then you can utilize that, that person or a friend, or you can just call us and we can get you in for a clinical appointment. So it's about acknowledging that there's a need and reaching out and speaking to another person who gets it and who can support you with whatever you have going on around it. Yeah.
How would people get in contact?
So they can go to our website, which is thebadgegroup.com. So it's www.thebadgegroup.com. Our office number is 720-507-3551. So either of those, or our email, admin@thebadgegroup.com. Or they can call the Fraternal Order of Police or go to their lodge leadership and ask for some type of communication or contact with psych services for the FOP.
And, if you go on the Colorado Police Officers Foundation website, coloradopolicefoundation.org, there's information there about the program and how to access services as well. Thanks.